So for the folks I don't know, I'm Sarah Bridges. Like James, who's on the call, I originally came out of PDI, that's part of Korn Ferry, an organizational psychology consulting firm. My background is in neuropsych, and as someone who's coached executives and leaders for a long time, it's been a really exciting time in the last 20 years to see what we're learning in terms of neuropsychology and brain science and its application, not just to all of us as humans, but all of us as coaches, leaders, managers, for that matter, partners, parents, you name it, and really applicable things we can think about. So let's dive right in, if we could, Kenzie, in terms of getting started. And you can go right to the next one. So clearly we're talking about mindset, and just to give a working definition for us right now, I am really including thoughts, beliefs, expectations that we have that determine and shape objective reality. That sounds like a big thing to say. You will understand where that is coming from. Mindset, kind of in the popular press, especially with all of the important work being done on growth mindset versus fixed mindset, have led many people and a lot of the coaching clients we have to think that this is just a thinking game. I need to think my way into a better mindset, and then all of a sudden I'm going to have better performance. What we're going to touch on today is that there are so many factors that go into mindset, many of them in our brains, many of them outside of our brains. And any of these that we talk about have possibility for tweaking, shifting, so that we can really leverage the best kind of thinking and beliefs to reach goals and help other people to do that. And let me just start with a little story to illustrate this, and this is a personal one. The rest of the information you're going to get will be peer-reviewed science. So 2.5 years ago, I'm a lifelong runner, out running in the winter with a bunch of dogs, not my wisest move, on the ice, middle of January. One of the dogs jumped to the side, and I went flying up and down and landed on the curb and broke my femur in 3 different places. Breaking your femur is not a fun thing to do. So I head into the hospital and have to have surgery right away. And the doctor that did it, the orthopedist, said to me as I'm recovering, you said the funniest thing as we were going to surgery, of course, on a lot of drugs. You said to me, hey, do you think I can still run the marathon? Well, I had a marathon I was training for in 4 months. And I said to him, what did you answer? And he said, oh, sure, which I took as sure. Now, pandemic intervened, couldn't run a marathon if I wanted to. And I started physical therapy, elliptical, everything else. Meanwhile, my best friend from college, another psychologist, started sending me information and stories on people who'd broken their femurs, including athletes, and went on to do all sorts of things. So in the next 3 months, started running again. And when I got to that 4-month point, the marathon would have been, I did a 20-mile run to see if I could do it, and I could. And what happened was at the 6-month appointment, I went back and talked to the doctor and told him my story. And he said, you ran what? And I said, I did that to see if I could. And he said, have you seen your notes from the physical therapist? And I said, no. And he said, she was writing down, she thought you'd have a perceptible limp the rest of your life. I didn't know that was in my documentation.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So
Sue, I think you're on. Someone is
getting married in November. It's going to be
Sue?
A very small wedding.
Sue? Okay, thank you. Perfect. Someone had their mute on. I say this story to give you a little backdrop on mindset, and we're going to talk into a lot of different pieces. I'm 2.5 years out. I run every day for an hour a day. It has not affected my running at this point, and my leg is healed, which is possible if anyone breaks their femur. This is not something special or magical about me. We're going to talk about mindset and some of the things that went into that. So let's go to our next slide. And I'm going to be basic and cursory on some things that are not basic or simple. but just to give us some working language. So we have things in our brains, I'm sure you've heard of them, called neurotransmitters. And basically, these are chemicals that allow communication between neurons in your brain. Some of the basic ones, and ones that you may well have heard about, serotonin. Serotonin tends to relate to being content with right now, being content in the current moment. Dopamine, which has been accurately and inaccurately talked about as the reward molecule, does tie to reward, but even a bigger piece of it has to do with motivation, giving us a drive towards more. In fact, many people call it the molecule of more. That is why it underpins really good things, big accomplishments, and also things like addiction. Acetylcholine is another one I'm going to talk about, particularly around growth mindset. And acetylcholine has to do with having a spotlight on attention and learning. It is present when something is meaningful to us, we're concentrating on it, and it tends to facilitate learning and good memory of that event. So let's go to our next slide. And here is the basic framework, and then we're going to go deep on each of these areas. So how does a person's mindset either lead to learning new skills, possibilities, or not? For the first thing, it really sets the parameters for what's even possible. Secondly, there's a role that both the brain and the body, and I hate even separating them, it's kind of one thing. I mean, the brain is part of the body. The brain influencing body chemistry influencing our brain chemistry, which means mindset. And both can have levers in terms of how we're feeling, what we're doing. There are also unconscious influences, and we'll talk through what those are. And then lastly, the environment outside of us, and that includes those humans we hang around with, also have a huge influence, often totally below our awareness, on the kind of mindset we have going into tasks, situations, you name it. So let's go deeper on each one, and then I'm going to pause at the end of each one because we're going to be talking about research. So let's go to our next slide and talk first about parameters of what's possible. I told you my story. One of the components to being able to not end up with walking forever with a limp and not running and running was my friend Nina sending me a bunch of examples of people that had had the same injury, come back from it, and were doing very well. I knew that was possible. Let's take it. Many of you have heard this story. If you haven't, it's one of my favorites as a runner, of the 4-minute mile. So let me back you up in history a little bit. All the way back to 1888, runners had been trying to break a 4-minute mile, run faster than that. If you read the science from that time, the leading physicians were saying things like your heart would explode in your chest. There was a belief that we physically could not do that. And guess what happened for the next 70 years? Nobody did it. They got close, but they didn't do it. And then came a man named Roger Bannister, who first of all was very unconventional. Everybody else was training with coaches and regimens. He was a medical student. He didn't have a lot of time for his training. He would do it on his lunch hour. And he tended to be a lone wolf. He was kind of doing his own thing. He went out in 1954 and broke the 4-minute mile. He ran it in 3 minutes and 59 seconds. They'd said if it ever happened, it would have to be ideal circumstances. He ran it in wet weather. It was slippery. It wasn't hard clay. There wasn't a cheering crowd. They said that was critical, and he did it. And what happened in the next year, after 70 years of no action, was fascinating. First of all, his biggest competitor did the exact same thing, even beating him by a second within a couple of months. By the time we go a whole year later, 3 people are breaking it in one race. What is happening here? In a year's time, in months' time, we're certainly not getting better at running. Something has happened up here. Another example of this is a famous story of a statistician named George Danzig, who went to the University of California, Berkeley, and this is going all the way back to 1937. He was an aspiring statistician and wanted to take an upper level course to stretch his skills, and one day was late to class and kind of barreled in there, and up on the board were the take-home assignments for a test that they were having. He wrote them all down, and he turned in his assignment just under the wire. He turned them in. One of the problems was really hard, and the teacher called him in and said, "I need to talk to you about your tests." And he said, "Oh, I know, I really struggle with the last one." And what came out was what the teacher had put up there was an unsolvable statistical problem, just as an example that had been around since the time of Einstein. Nobody could solve it. He had thought it was a homework assignment. What we think is possible, these are big stories, even in little stories, shape what actually is possible to happen. And as we work with people or work with ourselves, we need to really understand that limits we set are limits we get. So let me go on to the next slide. So brain and body chemistry, again, bidirectional. This idea we can separate these two is fallacious. We can't. They are totally interconnected. Simple examples: physiology, what's happening in our body drives our psychology. Numerous studies have shown that when we're feeling really tired, physically tired, sleepy, sleep deprived, and we're asked to estimate distance, how far we need to walk, how steep a hill is, we consistently overestimate how far that distance is. Our body is tired, our brain tells us it's too far. Conversely, psychology, what we're thinking, what we believe, drives even physiological factors in our body that are not under conscious control. And this is some of the data that I think should just make everybody's head kind of do a. There's a researcher named Aaliyah Crum who studied this and had a very interesting finding. If you have not read this in the popular press, you can look this up. It's really interesting, the milkshake study. She wondered what would happen when people drank a milkshake that they either believed was very filling and caloric, or a milkshake that was a slim fast type diet, one that was very low calorie. Would there be any discernible differences in their bodies? And of course, we know there should be. There's something called ghrelin, which is a hunger hormone that slowly rises as our stomach is empty and makes you feel hungry. So she gave the folks these drinks. One was 150 calories and one was 640 calories, all normal, and then measured their ghrelin levels about 60 minutes later. And sure enough, the folks that had the diet drink were having ghrelin rising quickly and they were getting hungry. The other group was not. Ghrelin isn't something we can control. We can't think, I want to be less hungry. Here's the kicker though. Everybody in the study drank the identical milkshake. Their beliefs about what they were drinking changed physiological factors in their body below conscious control. Let me take it even a step further. And if you like this stuff, read the book Counterclock by someone named Dr. Ellen Langer. She's at Harvard. She was very curious about mindsets and beliefs and what it did to physiology, even things we don't control. And she did a famous study with some 80-year-old men that she took to an old monastery for a week-long, what she called a time traveler's retreat. And she said to them, we are going to be stepping back 20 years in time. So everything on the wall, all the media, all the conversation, the food, the furniture was set as if we were 20 years back in time. Now, preceding them going to the monastery, these folks had all sorts of measures done for them, everything from their vision to their blood pressure to their strength in different ways to their height. I mean, you name it, it was measured. And then she just turned them loose and they got to have their period of time. What she found at the end of the study was that on physiological markers that we can't change, thinking I want my vision to be better, or I want my strength to be better, or I want my blood pressure, blood sugars to be better, changed in a positive direction as if the men were turning back the clock on their physiological age. What we think about is incredibly powerful. This is not the same thing as saying, I'm going to manifest something, not trying to disparage. It is saying that what we are thinking about on a regular basis has all sorts of chemical imprints in our body. And over time causes changes that you wouldn't be able to just say, I want my blood pressure to go down, and it happens. So just to drive further on the mindset, and then we're going to pause at the end of this for any questions people have, to thinking even further about body and brain and mindset, let's think a little bit about decision-making. Let's think about decision-making, motivation, comfort with risk. What we know about humans, whether we are a night owl or someone who considers themselves an early bird, we have something in common, which is as we wake up, our level of cortisol, which is called the stress hormone, it also has some very positive effects of waking us up, making us alert, and our level of dopamine is highest. So it definitely speaks to any kind of difficult, cognitively demanding work that we want to do. Often it's best to do it right when we get up. The researchers in the parole study were very curious about whether simple things like time of day or physiological measures could make a difference on something as objective as making a decision about who should be let out of jail and who had to stay there. And so they studied judges in Israel and controlled for the folks that they were deciding about. So similar background, similar, past criminal history or not, etc. And looked at whether they granted parole, whether they kept them in. And let's deconstruct this for a minute. Granting parole is a risky thing to do in the sense that just saying someone's in jail, stuff isn't going to go wrong. If I let someone out, there's always a chance some of them won't do well. So it takes a bigger cognitive lift to decide to do that. So what did they find? When the people they were vetting were controlled, you wouldn't think it made a difference, but you better hope you saw the judge first thing in the morning, right after breakfast, before they were really fatigued. If you did, your odds of getting out were much higher. If you were unlucky enough to see a judge right before lunch, good luck. You're probably staying in jail. Once again, after lunch, so their glucose is back up, they've eaten, they've probably moved around a little bit, gotten a mental break, goes back up. End of the day, you're staying in jail. I'm simplifying, but the trends were very consistent, and this has been borne out again. So if we think about our mindset, if we need to make a difficult decision or we have a cognitively demanding task, the time of day really matters. Same with your group, same with your time. And then the last thing I want to say on brain and body, and this ties to growth and fixed mindset also, is the criticality of mistakes from a brain chemistry standpoint. Why is that? Our brains are basically constantly trying to make predictions about what's going to happen next. It's a way that it keeps us safe and all well. When we make a mistake, the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of your brain, sends a signal that something is wrong. Pay attention. There's an error. I was predicting X and Y happened. And acetylcholine, the chemical I talked about before, that puts a spotlight on what's happening, and facilitates learning is released. And if we take that time to reflect and to learn and to dig into that, those actual neurons are wired together more strongly. If we conversely try to just ignore, get past, or I don't even want to have a mistake, we are losing one of the prime times we can have neuroplasticity. It's a critical time. Acetylcholine isn't released when you status quo got it right. So I'm hoping we can have a different appreciation even for things like mistakes. I'm going to pause here and ask if there are any questions, thoughts before we move on to the next.
Sarah, I'm curious, with the acetylcholine, is that something that we can consciously create, like that spotlight, if we just are intentional about it? Is that the sort of part of the point?
That is such a good question. And yes, when we focus deeply and when something is meaningful to us, which as an aside, for us humans, when we make a mistake, it's automatically meaningful to us. But when we concentrate deeply and undistracted, you do release acetylcholine. So even back to, we won't go down the path of, tech and everything else, but the constant distraction literally is inhibiting our ability to learn. It just is, because we are not doing the deep concentration on a task at hand.
Right. That's so helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, let's go to our next one. Whoop, I think you got one, Kenzie. Oh, you just wrote one in there. All good. So we've talked about mindset has all sorts of inputs that's influencing it. Whoops. There you go. Perfect. One of the things that's very heavily influencing it, and I had said at the start, if there's an area you want a deeper dive, this is a gold mine, because I am scratching the surface on some of the variables I'm talking about. There is so much good peer-reviewed data on what's influencing us at all times. But let's think about a couple of them. And this is whether you're working with a coaching client or you manage someone, any of the above. One of the key things is assumptions. And you often know assumptions. We're not great at seeing them in ourselves, sadly, but we're really good at seeing them in other people. And binary beliefs, it's good or it's bad, this always happens, it never happens, are a really good clue that there's something very fixed in there that you might want to think about. That drives even what's possible. And then other factors come into play, like confirmation bias. If I believe there is no possible way I'm going to recover from this injury or recover from this divorce or losing this job, it actually drives the realm of what I see as possible, the advice I get, what I'm reading, what I remember, which then drives what I'm doing, which then drives possible outcomes. Our self-explanatory style, which is just a way of saying how we talk to ourselves, also has a huge influence on mindset. And if you've never tuned into your own little soundtrack, maybe intermittently, try doing it for a day. And think about the experiment. If I said out loud everything I'm thinking, what would people think of me? I had one executive do that, and he said, God, I tune in, that guy is a jerk, which is often the feeling that people have when they tune into how we're talking to ourselves, and without even conscious awareness, explaining things to ourselves. I had two different executives recently in the last year, both lose their jobs, downsizing, reorging, everything else. And of course, it was a good time to get back out there. One of them said, I really feel like this is a thing from the universe saying it's time to get moving. I've been talking about feeling stagnated, and I just got the kick in the pants, and it's time to get out there. The other one said, bad things always happen to me. No matter how hard I try, bad things happen. This is just a long line, bad bosses, bad this, bad that. You can imagine, as we look at how they then proceeded through the next 6 months, what kind of mindset was guiding each of them. How we explain things to ourselves is a crucial factor in how we're going to approach anything and have a mindset. For anyone who I imagine everybody knows, but growth versus fixed mindset is work that really has been done and made very salient by Carol Dweck, who's a wonderful psychologist at Stanford University, where she noticed working with children that some children, even when there's difficult tasks, basically will say to themselves, I'm not good at this yet. And other kids run into a difficulty and decide it means I'm not smart. So I might as not try. And the growth mindset is saying, not that I can be Magic Johnson if I practice every day, but I sure can get better at basketball. That I can get better at things that I apply effort for. So what I love about growth mindset is it ties right into what I just alluded to with brain science around acetylcholine. We've got to be able to have mistakes that we pause, really take in, and really learn from. That is your prime time for some neuroplasticity. Let's also talk about the way other people's expectations, and these again can be totally invisible unconscious influences, are affecting our
Sarah,
mind. Yeah.
I have a question. So going back to just what you talked about, and watching these youngsters, and of course I have my own youngster that I'm watching. In those studies, at that young age, is there an assumption that there is a biological basis for how those kids start, or is there environment that's being added that is creating that, even at that these 1-2 year old kiddos?
It's such a good question. And you ask 10 psychologists, you'll get different answers. I think the answer, as we're coming to understand with most behaviors and even diseases, is it's both. So if you think about people have different versions of the serotonin allele, the gene can be different lengths. I won't go technical, but it has to do with how much serotonin I naturally have circulating. For people who have a lot, a stressor can come or a setback, and they tend to be pretty naturally resilient with it. For someone who has shorter versions, less serotonin naturally, the odds that a setback comes and it really demolishes them are much higher. And that's nobody's fault, adult or child. We have different biology in all sorts of ways. But there's also a lot of discussion. It's not all parents, which is really interesting. For a long time, people thought there must be congruence with parents having a fixed mindset and kids too. And some research that's come out is they often aren't the same. Kids are picking it up other places, even school, teachers, peers. So, what Carol Dweck would say, and a lot of research says, is that nicely, we don't have to have a fixed mindset about fixed mindsets. Even that is malleable to learning different ways of thinking about it and teaching kids self-explanatory styles, teaching about learning from mistakes, etc.
Interesting. Thank you.
So the others' expectations, I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, this is so interesting. All of us would know this to some degree. We feel it in our family or something else. But let's talk about, back even tying to what you're saying, Amy, about others' pieces. So there was a famous study I wrote in the 70s, it was actually the late 60s, that was done by a psychologist at Harvard named Robert Rosenthal and an elementary school teacher in California. And they became really curious in that period about what effect kids getting IQ tests and the IQ tests being told to the teachers were having on whether there was any effect on how teachers interacted with the kids. And I have told this to my cohorts. I grew up in California. I was one of those kids. I have a very vivid memory of the IQ testing and of being lined up in our class by IQ. Didn't want to be the tail of that train. Literally would do that and then put people into groups. It's cringeworthy today. So what they did was had teachers in this elementary school do the normal IQ testing and then told them, these are your smart kids. These are kids that are going to need extra attention. turned everybody loose and retested the kids at the end of the year. And sure enough, the tests were consistent. The only problem was the kids had been randomly assigned to either the high IQ, growth ready, or not. So something in the way the teachers had interacted with the kids had actually generated different results in the kids. And as an aside, I've said this to my coaching cohort groups. This is true with animals too, which just I think is crazy, having worked in an animal lab briefly, the University of Minnesota. When people are working rats or mice, favorite ones, and looking at things like tests of memory, and often you will have strains of mice that are either bred to be better in memory or thinking, or you name it, whatever. So in a study that was done where it was double blind, the person doing the study didn't know who was who. The researcher was told that he was testing smart and dumb mice to see how fast they could learn something. And they tested it, and sure enough, the mice bore out the results. And the mice were randomly labeled smart and dumb. In the way the mice were handled, likely in the way they talked to them, all sorts of subtle things, the mice perform differently. So we are social creatures who at all times are paying close attention to all the other humans around us, thinking about where we are in terms of status, friend or foe, how they're reacting to me. We can't help that. That's part of our wiring. But we can, as we'll talk about, think about people we spend the most time with. It's kind of like we can't change technology and social media or news and the negative bias. Our control piece that we have is to decide what we bring kind of into our diet. So let's go to our next slide. Talk more about inputs or outputs. And I talk role models and media. We can't change our family. And often people will say, oh, top 5 people, well, I'm shot. Not true. Then we need to very consciously go out and find some other role models and some other people maybe who lift us up versus drag us down or believe in us or encourage us, whatever the case might be. Media are a huge source of role models, often unconsciously. And I won't go into a whole thing on social media, especially for people who have developing brains up until they're 25. I'm sure you know a lot of it from the headlines. The data tends to be negatively skewed, but even more importantly, I talked about we're always paying attention to people around us. Social media drives what's called upward comparisons. I'm comparing what I know is true about me, my actual body, my accomplishments, my relationships with a very curated greatest hits. So I am continually comparing up and coming up kind of lacking, not doing too great. What we know is when people compare down, when they're asked to really think about people who don't have as much as we do, we actually feel better. And that's part one of the many components to why, for instance, volunteering in some way can make us more aware of what we do have. But media and role models are huge, and as are people around us. So a famous study started all the way back in 1948 in Framingham, Massachusetts, and it's called the Framingham Heart Study. And it's a prospective study. They wanted to track people over the next decades to see what happened to their health while they're meanwhile every 4 years doing intense medical and psychological testing, also having them track things, see if we can figure things out. Kind of right now, everyone's healthy. Let's see what happens. All sorts of things came out of this, and we could talk about the biological pieces. Here's though the nugget that I think really stunned everyone. As the New York Times put in one of their headlines, "Do my friends make me fat?" Or you could put it the other way, are my friends making me healthy? I mean, again, fat is a much more negative one. It catches your eye. That's more exciting. What they found is that having friends, let's use the positive example, who worked out, I'm talking about people up into their 70s or 80s, having a friend or your friend having a friend who really engaged in healthy behaviors, up significantly the chances you will too. So why is this? Well, we human animals, and this is partly, we come from a long line of ancestors that had to be part of a group that accepted them in order to survive. And guess what? The ones that survived had that trait. We still have it up here. We're very wired into conforming and concording with people around us. My question is, in terms of my mindset or any other element of my life, you know, am I getting the concordance I want? Am I surrounded by the people that are helping me do that? If you think about, it can be for alcoholism, but there's 12-step groups, you name it, they have it. I mean, there's all sorts of magic to those. One of the biggest points of magic is you have a bunch of role models that are doing what you want to be doing. They've overcome this thing. They're not gambling their house away anymore. They can show you they're living the lifestyle, and we concord to that. We also, our mindset, whether it's we're doing deep cognitive work or creative work or mindless email, even the physical space we are in, as in the room we're sitting in, or if we're outside, has a huge influence on what's going on inside our brain. So space dimensions, one piece of research that's been shown repeatedly is the height of the ceiling level ties to the level of creativity. Higher the level, higher level of creativity. Having a window view. We know that looking at nature, or better, walking in nature, and again, you come from a long line of ancestors that was common to, has a very healing psychological effect. But you may not know that if you're recovering from surgery and you're lucky enough to be looking out at a garden scene, your odds of taking painkillers go down, your pain reports go down, how long you're in the hospital goes down. So what is happening around us directly affects our brain chemistry, our mood, our mindset, our physical health. And then I would also say and really encourage people to think about one other thing, which is in the role of environment, whether it's ourselves trying to start a new habit, whether it's folks who are working with trying to break one of the key things to really think about is what I call friction. And if kind of the tagline, the simplified way of thinking about this is, if I want to stop doing it, make it harder. If I want to start doing it, make it easier. Simple as that. Countries that make you check a box to opt out of donating your organs if you die have a 90% higher organ donation, because people don't just check the box. If I have to check to say I will do it, now that sounds crazy. How hard is it to check a box? We are really funny creatures in that way, and very small tweaks to environment make a huge difference. Huge difference. So thinking about it, there was a study done with a candy bowl when they were ostensibly doing another research study, but the real study was how much candy people ate. They put it in the middle of the room and tried just different scenarios. Nothing was different except for whether the candy bowl was 18 inches further away. Candy eating plummeted if you had to reach 18 inches. We are really funny creatures. We're not aware we do that. We are biased towards status quo and making things a little harder when we don't want to do them, or making them easier, removing the friction when we do want to do them, is one of the fastest ways we can affect our mindset and how we're approaching goals.
Sarah, it's more of a comment than a question, but you're making me think of a couple of my clients I've been working with. The remote work has really, as much as they love it, you know, they're saying, I just don't feel as creative anymore. And, you know, they don't feel part of a tribe. They don't feel belonging. Yep. And with one of them, their company doesn't have offices, right? So, their apartment is their workspace. And I guess maybe I wasn't doing it scientifically, but now thinking about it, we started thinking about, well, then how can you use your community as like filling in all those office rituals that you did before in order to change your environment. But now the science behind it matches up with the discussion we were having. So thank you
I
for.
love that, Jill. I mean, great. You just had the intuition of it. The other thing you're talking about that's a whole nother topic, but so important, is having some diversity in your routine. Tends to lift mood, raises dopamine, makes us just feel better. Tends to generate learning. I mean, even small things that are different. The people contact totally ties to how we're feeling. That's the physiology piece that drives what's possible and how creative. So really good things you're doing just naturally.
Thank you. But I like matching it with the science. So this is great.
Yeah.
I can tell you, Jill, just the last 2 mornings, I have had my best friend on FaceTime next to me, both working, but just to have send this.
Yeah.
Yesterday we chatted while we worked, and today we did not chat hardly at all. And I needed that just to have that connection. And it is the work from home and, entrepreneurship and all those things that's, I'm doing it right now.
I love that. That is outstanding. So let's go to our next slide. And these are just a summary list of things to think about. And then I'm going to save the last few minutes for questions, comments. The other thing I'll tell you as an enticement to give us some feedback to know where to go deeper next time in the NeuroLab, we will send you a robust checklist with some specifics on these different areas. And that will be a thank you if you will fill out our survey. So a couple of things you can think about working with mindset clients, directs, family. Really, first of all, understanding from the individual's viewpoint, what are the parameters of what's possible? If someone's never seen it, it's hard to be it. And we hear about this a lot, when we're working, for instance, in diverse communities, if they're not role models, it's really tough to think this applies to me. Limiting beliefs. You can pick up on those pretty quickly when you are talking to someone about possibility, about what they've tried, etc. And really listening to self-explanatory style. And I might ask about mistakes that have happened, how they're interpreting those, what happened next, to try to get a read if that's something you need to zero in on. Brain and body chemistry, I just can't say enough of. If we're going to tackle mindset, we have to be doing it in conjunction with living in this physical, breathing, moving body. Time of day makes a difference. The neurochemicals present make a difference. We talked about intense, difficult work is a lot easier when we first get up. Cortisol's up, so we're more awake. Dopamine is higher for people naturally, so we have more motivation to drive through things. Later in the day, certainly in the evening, serotonin tends to be higher, which tends to be better when we're doing more creative, ideating kind of work. So thinking about those things, we could do a whole nother section on movement, food, and light, which all play a huge role into the physiology piece. Kind of quick little tidbit on light, which I harp on a lot. The only part of your brain that's outside of your skull are your eyes. Your brain is, kind of floating around in there, clueless of what's happening out here. So the only way that your body, and you have multiple little circadian clocks with all your organs, with your sleep cycle, with everything else is set, is by having actual real light coming into your eyes. So within 30 minutes of getting up and getting some sunlight into your eyes, which can be 10 minutes of sitting and drinking coffee outside, walking outside, you don't have to, you're not staring at the sun. You will not only enhance your sleep, but it helps you set your clocks so that your energy levels are in sync. It's also tied to mood. Vitamin D we get through sun ties to dopamine manufacturing in our bodies and serotonin. And hey, we live in Minnesota. And there's a reason why, for instance, the artificial lights, and you'll have to look for one that's bright enough, really do work but they take a lot longer than outside light. You're going to need to have hours. The other little tidbit I will give you is that I cringe when I hear about people wearing blue blockers all day. We are meant to get blue light in our eyes during the day. That's part of how we're awake. We don't want to be blocking just one spectrum. And I can send you research on this if you're interested. In the evening, sure. But during the day, blue light is meant to be part of what we are seeing and experiencing. So just throw that little tidbit out. Thinking with you or your clients about unconscious influences, this can be really helpful in understanding mindset, other people, expectations, the goalposts, what they think is possible. And then please don't do this work without taking note of the environment. It's really critical. The space, the media diet, the people, the culture, the friction. How are those things playing or not into the mindset the person has?